Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a file that I think is just critical for anyone who's ever felt really deeply unwell, but then got told, hey, your labs look totally normal.
Right, that frustrating disconnect.
Exactly. We're diving deep into what some of our sources are calling a hidden epidemic, really. It's cellular starvation. Like, your body's control panel looks green, but the engine itself, it's seizing up.
Yeah, it's this huge paradox in medicine, isn't it? And it seems to be fueling so much chronic illness across the world. So today we're really digging into specifics for you, the listener.
Right.
We want to provide that technical evidence that explains why you might feel that profound fatigue, the brain fog, maybe metabolic issues, even when the basic tests look okay.
We're going beyond the usual suspects, TSH and T4.
Way beyond.
Yeah.
We're focusing on the metric that seems to matter most right down at the cellular level, and that's the ratio between T3 and reverse T3.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit because we're talking about a situation, right, where someone goes to the doctor, they get the standard test, the TSH, maybe T4, and everything comes back looking, perfect, like textbook normal.
Right within the range. You're fine.
But inside, at the cellular level, things are completely different. Their cells are essentially what? Starving for the fuel they need.
Precisely. Starving for active T3. That's the core issue, cellular T3 starvation. Even with good labs, it's about cellular efficiency, not just how much hormone the thyroid is pumping out overall.
And that's the mission today, right? To really show why this happens, why this cellular starvation occurs, and explore the evidence that suggests, well, that a failure in using T3 properly could be maybe the single biggest unrecognized root cause of modern chronic disease.
It's a massive claim, but the data points in that direction. It's about looking deeper.
Okay, but before we get lost in the weeds of the mechanism, let's give people the actionable takeaway right up front. This comes straight from the research we looked at. If you suspect you've got metabolic issues, or maybe just unexplained chronic fatigue that won't go away, you need to ask your doctor for the full thyroid panel. And specifically, you need free T3 and reverse T3 tested.
Yes, because you need both those numbers to calculate the ratio. That ratio, the free T3 to reverse T3 ratio, that is the key diagnostic marker we're focusing on today.
And there's a specific number, a threshold that the sources highlight.
There is. And it's pretty clear. If that T3 to reverse T3 ratio is consistently less than 10, well, that strongly suggests your cells might be in that T3 starvation state we're talking about.
Less than 10, okay.
That number 10, it's like an early warning signal. It points to a major inefficiency in your body's energy system, those standard TSH tests. They just fly right over it.
So it separates just looking at the gland from looking at how the cells are actually using the hormone.
Exactly. Cellular function versus global assessment.
All right, so let's get into that relationship then. T3 versus reverse T3. Because understanding how these two interact, well, that seems to be the whole ballgame, doesn't it? The difference between feeling okay and actually functioning well.
It really is. The literature often describes them as functional opposites. Think of it like the accelerator and the emergency brake for your metabolism.
Okay, I like that analogy. Accelerator and brake. So T3 is the accelerator.
Precisely. T3, or triiodothyronine if we're being technical, that's the active thyroid hormone. Most of it actually comes from converting T4, which is more of a storage or precursor hormone.
Right, the body makes mostly T4 and has to convert it.
Yeah, and T3 is crucial because it's the one that binds to receptors inside the cell nucleus. It basically throws a switch for genes related to energy production.
So it sets your metabolic rate, how fast your engine is idling?
Exactly. Basal metabolic rate, mitochondrial activity, energy levels. T3 is the signal telling your body's engine to run and run efficiently. That's your gas pedal.
Okay, gas pedal makes sense. But then there's this other molecule, reverse T3 or RT3. The sources call it a lookalike, but it sounds like it's more than just inactive. It's actually, what, inhibitory?
It is. It's not just neutral. It actively gets in the way.
Yeah.
But, in certain situations, RT3 production is actually a brilliant survival mechanism. It's not inherently bad.
Okay, explain that. When is this break actually helpful?
Well, reverse T3 is made when the body deliberately shifts how it converts T4. Instead of making active T3, it makes RT3. This happens during times of really severe acute stress.
Like what kind of stress?
I mean, true starvation, like famine conditions, or major physical trauma, like a big surgery, or a massive systemic infection like sepsis. In those moments, the body's #1 priority is survival, which means conserving energy at all costs.
Ah, okay. So RT3 is the signal to slam on the brakes and save fuel.
Exactly. It's a gift in that scenario. By making RT3 instead of T3, The body drastically cuts the metabolic rate. It conserves protein, stops muscle breakdown, saves energy for just the vital organs. It's pure survival mode.
That makes total sense for an emergency. If you're starving, you don't want to be burning energy unnecessarily. But the problem we're looking at today isn't the acute crisis, is it? It's when the brake stays on after the danger has passed.
That's the crux of it. The sources really emphasize that under chronic stress, which is, let's face it, incredibly common today.
Relentless.
Yeah, relentless inflammation, maybe a low-grade chronic infection humming in the background, constantly high cortisol from life stress, even persistent dieting. Under those conditions, RT3 production can get stuck in the on position.
So the emergency's over technically, but the body is still acting like it's starving or under attack?
Precisely. The high levels of RT3 keep circulating, they start to overwhelm the system, and they end up actively starving the cells of the T3 they need, even when the immediate crisis is long gone.
Okay, so how does that actually work? How does this look-alike molecule RT3 physically starve the cell if there's still active T3 floating around in the blood? This is the competitive bind idea, right?
Yes, and this is absolutely critical to understand the pathology.
Yeah.
So active T3 needs to get inside the cell and bind to its specific receptor, usually in the nucleus, to kickstart energy production.
Okay.
But when RT3 levels are pathologically high, you've got way more of these look-alike inactive molecules floating around, bathing the outside of the cell.
So the cell is trying to grab thyroid hormone, like it's trying to unlock a door.
Good analogy.
And it sees two keys floating past, the real T3 key that works and this RT3 key that looks almost identical but doesn't actually turn the lock.
Exactly. Because RT3 is what's called a stereoisomer of T3. Same atoms, same structure, but it's a mirror image, and that makes it inactive biochemically. But structurally, it's close enough.
Close enough to fool the transport mechanism into the cell.
Yes, the cell pulls it inside. But once inside, RT3 fits into the T3 receptor site, the lock, but it can't activate it. It just sits there jamming it up.
It blocks the spot where the real T3 needs to go.
Right. It occupies the binding site. So the cell is effectively misinformed.
Yeah.
It thinks it's getting the signal, or rather the signal site is occupied, preventing the real signal from getting through.
So the active T3 is stuck outside or can't bind if it does get in, and the RT3 is inside doing nothing useful, just taking up space.
And that presence of RT3 inside the cell, occupying those receptors, acts like a metabolic switch. It forces the cell into a sustained low metabolic state. That is the cellular starvation we're talking about.
Wow, and that happens regardless of how much T4 the thyroid is making, or even how much T3 is technically in the bloodstream overall.
Correct. It bypasses the pituitary signals, TSH. It's a problem at the point of use of the cell itself.
And that explains the paradox, doesn't it? Why someone can have perfect TSH and T4 labs.
Because the gland might be working fine, making plenty of raw material.
But they still feel every single classic hypothyroid symptom, the crushing fatigue, the weight gain that won't budge, maybe hair loss, depression.
All of it. Because the active T3 simply cannot do its job where it matters inside the cell at the nuclear receptor. The cellular engine is stalled even if the main fuel gauge looks full. Hashtag tag 5. Conventional medicine's blind spot.
Okay, this leads us straight into why conventional medicine seems to miss this so often. They're looking upstream, right? At the gland, not at the conversion or the cell.
That's generally the approach, yes. Standard practice focuses heavily on TSH, maybe adding free T4.
So what are they not measuring? What are the crucial pieces missing from that standard picture?
Well, it falls into a few key areas, really. First, the essential hormone measurements themselves are incomplete. To see this pattern, you absolutely must test free T3.
The actual active hormone.
Yes, the unbound usable stuff. And you must test reverse T3, the inhibitor. And critically, you need both to calculate the T3/RT3 ratio.
That ratio, again, it keeps coming back.
Because without the ratio, you're flying blind. A doctor might see a free T3 that's low normal and an RT3 that's maybe high normal and think, it's acceptable. They completely miss the functional implication, the competitive binding effect.
So the ratio tells you how much active hormone there is relative to the blocker. It's about utilization.
Precisely. That's the first big blind spot. The second is ignoring the cofactors needed for the conversion process itself.
Ah, right. T4 doesn't just magically become T3. It needs help.
It needs enzymes called deionases to make that conversion happen efficiently. And those enzymes, they require specific nutrients to work properly.
Okay, let's list those, because this really connects nutrition to thyroid function in a direct way.
3 main ones stand out in the research we reviewed: zinc, selenium, and iron. Selenium is particularly crucial. It's a core component of the main deiodinase enzymes D1 and D2 that make active T3.
So no selenium, poor conversion.
Or sluggish conversion, yeah.
Hmm.
Zinc plays a supporting role too, needed for enzyme function. And iron, specifically your stored iron levels, or ferritin, is vital.
Why iron?
Iron is needed for the initial production of thyroid hormones in the gland, and it influences the deiodinase enzymes. If someone is iron deficient, even just low ferritin, not full-blown anemia,
Which is really common, especially in women.
very common. That low iron state can slow everything down and actually push the conversion pathway towards making more reverse T3 instead of active T3.
Wow. So nutrient deficiencies aren't just a separate issue. They can directly cause this hormonal block. It's not just a hormone problem then.
It's often a nutritional problem, manifesting as a hormonal one. And then there's the third blind spot, the massive influence of stress hormones, particularly cortisol.
Okay, how does cortisol play into this T3-RT3 balance?
Chronic stress, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical, keeps cortisol levels high. And elevated cortisol sends a direct signal to the body to ramp up the activity of a different deiodinase enzyme called D3.
And what does D3 do?
D3's main job is to convert T4 into reverse T3. And high cortisol also tends to inhibit the D1 and D2 enzymes that make active T3.
So chronic stress basically tells the body, emergency, make the break, RT3, not the gas, T3.
That's a perfect summary. It's the body trying to slow metabolism down to survive what it perceives as a long-term threat. So if doctors aren't asking about chronic stress, aren't testing cortisol rhythm, aren't looking at nutrient status, they're missing the key triggers that are causing the conversion to fail in the first place.
And the result is snark, isn't it? The sources suggest millions of people are walking around T3 starved at the cellular level. They feel terrible. They have all these symptoms.
And they're told you're normal because the TSH and T4 are within range. These tests are just too far upstream to see the downstream blockage.
Which is why this is being called a hidden epidemic. And potentially, as you said, maybe the #1 unrecognized root cause of so much chronic disease today. It's not always a problem with the thyroid gland itself.
Often it isn't. It's a failure of the conversion and utilization pathway. The hormone isn't getting used properly where it counts. And, to really grasp the potential scale of this, looking at the systemic impact, it helps to understand a bit of the medical history here. There was a major shift in how hypothyroidism was treated, and it arguably set the stage for this widespread problem.
This is a really interesting point from the sources. We're talking about the shift away from older forms of thyroid medication. Before, say, the 1950s or 60s, what was the standard treatment?
The standard was often natural desiccated thyroid, or NDT, things like Armour thyroid or Nature thyroid. These are derived from actual animal thyroid glands.
And why was that potentially better at preventing this cellular starvation issue?
Because NDT, being a whole gland extract, naturally contains a mix of thyroid hormones. It has T4, yes, but it also contains T3, the active form.
So patients got both the precursor and the active hormone directly.
Exactly. Which meant their bodies weren't solely dependent on their own ability to convert T4 to T3. If their conversion was sluggish due to stress or nutrient issues, they were still getting a direct dose of active T3 from the medication itself.
Okay. But then medicine moved towards synthetic T4-only treatments, right? Levothyroxine became the gold standard.
It did. Post-1950s, there was a big push towards synthetic standardized medications. Levothyroxine, Synthroid, etc., contains only T4. And this shift was based on a really big assumption.
The assumption that everyone's body would just naturally and efficiently convert that T4 into all the T3 they needed.
Precisely. And what we're realizing now, based on the T3 toward RT3 ratio research and clinical observation, is that this assumption seems to be dangerously flawed for a pretty significant chunk of the population.
So for people who don't convert well,
due to all the reasons we just discussed, stress, inflammation, nutrient gaps, giving them T4 only basically guarantees they will remain functionally hypothyroid. They take their pill every day, their TSH might even look suppressed or perfect.
yeah, but they still feel awful because their T3 starved at the cellular level. The medication isn't fixing the core problem for them.
It isn't addressing the utilization block.
Now, here's where we need to be careful, but the sources do draw a, let's say, provocative correlation. They note that the big, sustained rise in many chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, autoimmune conditions, really took off in the latter half of the 20th century.
It did. And while nobody's saying T4-only medication caused all of modern chronic disease, that would be far too simplistic.
Of course, correlation isn't causation.
But if this shift in treatment meant millions of people were left with suboptimal cellular T3 levels decade after decade, well, it raises a powerful hypothesis.
That maybe this widespread, unrecognized failure of T4 to T3 conversion isn't just a root cause, but possibly the dominant underlying root cause. Not causing the diseases directly, perhaps, but creating the metabolic environment where they thrive.
That's the argument presented. It's compelling because if every single cell in your body is struggling to produce energy efficiently because it's starved for T3,
Then every system is compromised. It's like trying to run a whole city on a brownout. Everything starts to fail eventually.
it fundamentally weakens the foundation upon which health is built.
Okay, let's get specific then. Why exactly does low T3 utilization, the cellular starvation state, create such a vicious cycle? What fundamental biological processes break down, and how does that open the door for disease?
The impact is incredibly foundational because T3 is so central to cellular energy. When T3 signaling gets blocked or muffled by high RT3, there are at least 4 critical things that immediately go wrong.
Okay, number one.
The most obvious, the cell literally cannot make enough energy. Mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, they're exquisitely sensitive to T3. Low T3 signal means low ATP production,
Resulting in,
systemic fatigue,
yeah.
just that bone-deep exhaustion that doesn't get better with rest, and a general slowdown of all cellular processes.
Okay, what's number two? You mentioned inflammation earlier.
Yes, the failure to properly regulate inflammation. T3 plays a crucial role in modulating the immune system and resolving inflammation once the threat is gone. When cells are T3 starved, they seem to lose that ability to effectively switch off chronic low-grade inflammation,
So it just smolders on indefinitely.
creating a persistent systemic inflammatory state which we now know drives countless chronic diseases. The third failing is impaired detoxification.
How does T3 affect detox?
The liver and kidneys are metabolic powerhouses. Their detoxification pathways, especially phase I and phase II, require enormous amounts of energy, driven by T3. If T3 is low, detox slows down, leading to a buildup of toxins and metabolic waste.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the final piece, you mentioned repair.
Right. Poor healing and regeneration. Think
Mhm.
about tissues that need constant turnover and repair: the gut lining, skin, muscle, bone. All that cellular activity is highly energy dependent and T3 driven.
So T3 starvation means slow repairs, slow healing.
Dramatically slower, which means tissues stay damaged longer or don't regenerate properly. And this is key. Even if a disease has a totally different origin, say, a genetic predisposition or an infection, the sources argue that the low T3 state makes that illness worse.
How so?
It makes it more prolonged, more severe, and even more likely to develop in the first place simply because the body lacks the fundamental energy and metabolic regulation needed to fight effectively or recover fully. The terrain is weakened. #8. The comprehensive list of affected chronic diseases.
The list of chronic conditions potentially linked to or worsened by this T3 starvation state in the sources, it's just staggering. It covers almost every system. Let's walk through some of the major categories, starting with metabolic and cardiovascular stuff.
Yeah, the connections here are very direct and well documented in the research cited. T3 fundamentally controls how your body handles fats and sugars. So low T3 utilization directly contributes to things like dyslipidemia, messed up cholesterol levels, and high LDL cholesterol. Why? Because T3 regulates the number of LDL receptors on your cells. Fewer T3 signals mean fewer receptors, so the LDL cholesterol stays circulating in the blood instead of getting pulled into cells.
Ah, so it's not just about making cholesterol, but clearing it too.
Exactly, and that over time contributes to heart disease risk. Low T3 also impacts insulin sensitivity, making type 2 diabetes more likely. And of course, the overall slowed metabolism contributes to energy storage, leading to obesity and fatty liver disease. It's all interconnected metabolically.
Okay, what about the brain? Neurological and psychiatric conditions. You mentioned brain fog, but it goes deeper.
Much deeper. The brain is incredibly energy hungry. Neurons have massive metabolic demands. When they're starved for T3, they simply cannot function optimally.
Which leads to
This is where we see strong correlations with depression, anxiety, that persistent brain fog, and even increased risk or worsening of neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease, other forms of dementia, and just generalized cognitive decline. If the main energy switch is dimmed, most demanding organs suffer significantly. We'll get more into this with a schizophrenia link later.
Right. And then there are those conditions often dismissed as maybe psychosomatic, like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia.
Oh, absolutely. Chronic fatigue syndrome, CFSME, and fibromyalgia are often considered textbook examples, potentially rooted in T3 starvation by the authors we reviewed. If the mitochondria aren't getting the go signal from T3, The result is profound body-wide exhaustion.
And the pain in fibromyalgia.
The sources suggest that the widespread, often unexplained muscle aches and pain in fibromyalgia could be a direct result of this chronic cellular energy deficit. The muscles literally don't have the energy to function and repair properly.
Now, autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, how does low T3 play into things like Hashimoto's or lupus?
It seems to perpetuate the chaos. Remember, T3 helps regulate the immune system. When it's deficient at the cellular level, the immune system can become dysregulated, losing its ability to distinguish self from non-self, which is the hallmark of autoimmunity.
So it could worsen conditions like Hashimoto's.
Which is ironic, as Hashimoto's itself damages the thyroid,
Right.
potentially starting the T3 problem. But yes, also lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, celiac disease.
Yeah.
The low T3 state fuels the underlying inflammation and immune confusion.
And this extends to chronic infections, too.
Yes, things like reactivated Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, chronic candida overgrowth, even the lingering systemic inflammation seen in long COVID. In these states, inflammation drives up reverse T3, which then blocks active T3, preventing the body from fully recovering and resolving the inflammation. It's a feedback loop.
Okay, let's talk about the gut. You said this was maybe the clearest vicious cycle.
It really illustrates the interconnectedness. Low T3 utilization is strongly linked to common gut issues like IBS, leaky gut, intestinal permeability, GERD or reflux, and even the development of food sensitivities.
How does it cause leaky gut?
Remember, T3 drives cell repair and turnover. The gut lining has one of the fastest turnover rates in the body. It needs constant repair. Low T3 severely impairs this process. The gut lining becomes damaged, leaky.
Which lets things into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there, causing inflammation.
Exactly. And that inflammation then drives up reverse T3 production, worsening the T3 starvation. Plus, the leaky gut impairs nutrient absorption, including the zinc, selenium, and iron needed for T4 conversion in the first place.
Wow. So the low T3 makes the gut leaky. The leaky gut causes inflammation and nutrient loss, which makes the low T3 even worse.
It's a perfect storm. And this is particularly relevant for inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. The poor gut repair feeds the disease, and the disease worsens the metabolic dysfunction. Gallbladder issues are also mentioned, likely linked to altered bile metabolism.
Okay, lastly, the hormonal and systemic category. Things like fertility, bone health.
These are all processes requiring significant, well-regulated energy and hormonal balance. So we see links to PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, challenges with infertility, low libido, and various menstrual disorders. T3 influences sex hormone-binding globulin, SHBG,
Wow.
and interacts with other endocrine systems.
Beyond reproductive health.
Chronic T3 deficit impacts overall systemic health. Think osteoporosis, as bone turnover is T3 dependent. Anemia, often linked back to the iron issues or chronic inflammation. Neuropathy or nerve damage, possibly due to poor neuronal energy supply. Even things like chronic skin disorders and persistent sleep disturbance. It's clear that when the master metabolic regulator, T3, is effectively blocked by RT3.
Pretty much no system is safe. It affects everything.
Fundamentally.
Okay, now let's drill down into that specific connection requested by one of our listeners. This is where we see just how profoundly T3 metabolism impacts even the most complex brain functions. We're talking about the link between T3 starvation and schizophrenia.
Yes, this focus is incredibly important because it takes T3 dysfunction out of the realm of just feeling tired or gaining weight and places it as a potential major factor in severe mental health conditions. The research indicates T3 plays a direct regulatory role.
A regulatory role over what, specifically in the context of schizophrenia?
Primarily over the key neurotransmitters thought to be involved, particularly dopamine and serotonin. P3 influences both the synthesis of these neurotransmitters and the sensitivity of their receptors.
And schizophrenia often involves dopamine system dysregulation, right?
Correct. So if you have a T3 deficiency at the cellular level within the brain, the neural pathways involved lack both the energy for proper firing and the fine-tuned regulation needed for stable dopamine and serotonin signaling. The whole system becomes more fragile, more prone to imbalance.
Is this just a theoretical link, or is there clinical evidence?
There's both observational and some clinical data cited. Observationally, clinicians have noted for a long time that hypothyroidism, or at least thyroid dysfunction markers, seem to be unusually common in patients diagnosed with schizophrenia compared to the general population.
Okay. And clinically?
There are studies, often case reports or smaller trials, where adding T3 supplementation to the standard antipsychotic treatment regimen has actually improved symptoms, particularly in cases that were previously considered treatment-resistant.
That's fascinating. It suggests the T3 issue isn't just happening alongside the schizophrenia, but might actually be influencing its course or severity.
Exactly. It points towards T3 dysfunction being a metabolic modulator of the condition, not necessarily the initial cause, but a factor that can make it worse or harder to treat.
So how does the reverse T3 mechanism fit in here? How does higher T3 specifically worsen things in the brain for someone with schizophrenia?
It comes back to inflammation, which is increasingly recognized as a factor in schizophrenia, especially during acute phases. Schizophrenia can involve periods of heightened immune activation and elevated inflammatory cytokines in the brain and body.
And those cytokines
Are a direct signal, as we discussed, for the body to increase the conversion P44 into reverse T3 while simultaneously suppressing the conversion into active free T3.
So you get a localized T3 starvation state right there in the brain tissue.
Precisely. A profound cellular energy deficit hitting the very neurons that are already struggling with dysregulated signaling. The brain's high energy demands aren't met, the regulatory signals are weak. It essentially pours fuel on the fire of the pre-existing psychiatric condition.
So to be clear, the sources aren't saying low T3 causes schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is complex, multifactorial, with genetic and environmental components.
Absolutely not the sole cause. But they present T3 dysfunction, specifically this RT3-induced cellular starvation, as a significant modulating factor. It influences the severity, the persistence of symptoms, and critically, how well a patient might respond to standard treatments.
It's like trying to tune a very sensitive radio, the brain circuits, when the power supply is fluctuating wildly.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
You're trying to balance delicate neurochemistry with medications, but the fundamental cellular energy required for those circuits to operate stably is just not there. Addressing the T3 starvation may be by improving conversion factors, actively lowering RT3, or in some cases, carefully using T3 medication might restore that basic neuronal energy supply.
Potentially allowing the conventional psychiatric treatments to work much better.
That appears to be the therapeutic rationale suggested by the research. #1010. The link to creatine and brain processes.
Okay, this T3 starvation cascade, this energy deficit in the brain, leads us to the other specific point, the connection to creatine dysfunction. The sources state that T3 starvation interrupts key brain processes, including those involving creatine. First off, why is creatine so important for the brain? Most people just associate it with muscles.
Right, we think bodybuilders.
Yeah.
But creatine is absolutely vital for the brain. In the central nervous system, creatine functions as a critical, high-speed energy shuttle and buffer system.
Energy shuttle, what does that mean?
Neurons, especially during intense activity like processing information, firing signals, neurotransmission, they have incredibly high and fluctuating energy demands. They need ATP, the main cellular energy currency, right now.
Okay.
The creatine kinase system allows the cell to rapidly regenerate ATP right where it's needed, using phosphocreatine as a readily available energy reserve. It acts like a tiny, rechargeable battery pack within the neuron, buffering against sudden energy drains.
So it helps maintain energy stability during peak mental effort.
Exactly. It ensures the neuron doesn't run out of immediate power during critical tasks. Now connect that back to T3 starvation.
If the cell's overall metabolic rate is depressed because T3 is blocked,
And the mitochondria are struggling to produce enough baseline ATP.
then this whole creatine energy buffering system is going to be impaired too. It doesn't have enough energy to recharge itself effectively.
Precisely. The lack of fundamental energy synthesis, driven by the T3 block, undermines the brain's ability to maintain its high-energy phosphate reserves via the creatine system. The neuron becomes less resilient to metabolic stress. It struggles to meet those peak demands.
So the chain reaction is functionally clear. T3 starvation leads to low cellular energy, which impairs the creatine energy buffer system, and this combined metabolic breakdown contributes to the dysfunction seen in high energy demand brain conditions like schizophrenia or even dementia.
That's the integrated picture presented. The key insight for you, the listener, is understanding this functional consequence. While the sources confirm the link T3 needed for energy failure hits creatine dysfunction seen in these brain disorders, they emphasize the impact rather than, say, providing detailed molecular diagrams of enzyme inhibition.
It's about the functional breakdown. The T3 block robs the brain, the most energy-hungry organ, of both its primary fuel supply and its crucial backup power system.
Exactly. And when the brain can't buffer its energy supply effectively, it becomes inherently unstable.
And that instability manifests as severe cognitive symptoms, psychiatric symptoms. This really strengthens the argument, doesn't it, that testing T3 utilization, that T3R-T3 ratio, should maybe be standard practice when evaluating complex or treatment-resistant brain conditions.
It certainly makes a strong case for it. It suggests the problem might not just be, say, chemical imbalance alone, but could be rooted in a fundamental energy crisis within the neurons themselves.
A crisis completely missed if you only look at TSH.
Completely. It highlights that mental health and metabolic health are inextricably linked at the cellular level. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really peeled back the layers, hasn't it? Moving from just normal labs to what's actually happening inside a functionally unhealthy cell. We've covered a lot: the T3R-T3 dynamic, the competitive bind, the historical context, the massive list of chronic diseases, and this deep dive into brain function. Let's try to synthesize the absolute core takeaways for everyone listening.
I think the number one most crucial actionable point is this.
Mhm.
You have to be your own advocate. If you have those persistent symptoms, the fatigue, the fog, the weight issues, depression, any of those chronic conditions we listed, and your doctor has only run TSH and maybe T4 and said, you're normal.
Don't stop there.
Don't stop there.
Yeah.
You need to specifically request the full panel. That means free T3 and reverse T3. You need those two numbers.
So you can calculate the ratio. That T3 to RT3 ratio is the diagnostic key we've been hammering home.
It is. And remember that threshold number from the sources. A ratio consistently less than 10 is a major red flag for potential cellular T3 starvation. Keep that number in mind.
And understanding the mechanism helps empower that conversation with your doctor. Remembering the role of reverse T3, it's not just inactive, it's the emergency brake, the look-alike molecule that literally jams the cell's receptors for active T3.
Right. It explains why you can feel so bad even with normal T4. That blockage leads to systemic failure across the board, even impacting high-level brain processes involving energy and creatine, which can worsen conditions like schizophrenia.
The big picture takeaway, really, is that so often chronic disease seems to stem from these fundamental cellular energy deficits. It's not just about the disease label, it's about the underlying metabolic dysfunction.
And T3 starvation, often driven by chronic stress, hidden inflammation, or those nutrient deficiencies we talked about, selenium, zinc, iron, appears to be a prime suspect, forcing cells into that damaging long-term shutdown state. Asking for the T3 port RT3 ratio helps you look for that root cause, moving beyond just managing symptoms.
Identifying the root cause. That's the ultimate goal. Okay, and as always, we like to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to chew on that connects us back to the bigger picture.
Well, we talked about that historical shift, didn't we? Moving from NDT, which contained both T4 and T3, to T4-only therapy like levothyroxine, roughly coinciding with the rise in chronic diseases post-1950s.
Right.
Now, consider this observation from some of the sources. If you look at healthcare spending in the U.S., it wasn't just rising steadily, it started rising exponentially, particularly accelerating sharply from the 1990s onward.
Okay.
Think about the correlation. If the mainstream medical system, by largely ignoring free T3 and reverse T3, has failed to identify and correct poor T4 conversion and cellular T3 starvation in potentially millions of people for decades, what's the consequence?
Well, those people remain unwell. They keep needing treatment.
Exactly. They require continuous, often very expensive, lifelong treatments for the symptoms or the downstream consequences of that underlying metabolic block. The heart disease meds, the diabetes management, the costly antidepressants, the autoimmune drugs.
Instead of potentially addressing a fundamental, relatively easily measurable, and often correctable metabolic issue related to thyroid hormone utilization.
Precisely. So the provocative question is, how much of today's absolutely staggering burden of chronic illness and the resulting explosion in healthcare costs that feels so unsustainable? How much of that might be unintentionally fueled by this systemic failure to look beyond TSH, a failure to recognize the crucial importance of the T3 to reverse T3 ratio?
A failure to look past the gland and into the cell itself? Wow, that's a heavy question with enormous implications.
It connects a seemingly small molecular issue, that RT3 blockage, to potentially a multi-trillion-dollar systemic crisis in health and economics. Something worth reflecting on.
Definitely something to reflect on. Thank you for joining us on this absolutely crucial deep dive. We sincerely hope this information gives you the tools and the understanding you need to take control and advocate effectively for your own metabolic health.